today we're going to be talking a bit about communicable diseases. I think that this is a really fascinating topic because it's an area where we've actually had tremendous success because we've used a range of different public health strategies to address this form of disease. Now, that being said, it has historically had a tremendous impact globally on health. And when you think about global health, many countries are really still struggling with the communicable diseases as being the major causes of death in those communities. So it's clearly something that we really need to think about, especially given the fact that a lot of these communicable diseases are making a return with antibiotic resistance. And we might see increasing spreads of them due to climate changes, for example. So as I mentioned before, in the United States at least, the major causes of death actually are non-communicable diseases. So things like cancers and heart disease and a range of other conditions like that. That we do have one in that list of top 10, influenza and pneumonia, that is infectious disease. Flu actually causes about 30,000 deaths per year in the United States. So that being said, if you just went 100 years ago, well, actually communicable diseases were 4 out of that top 10 risk factors for mortality in the United States. So we've had a tremendous shift in terms of our ability to deal with these communicable diseases, partially because we've had some very effective technologies and changes in techniques for addressing communicable diseases that have actually been tremendously successful due to our advances in scientific knowledge. All right. So when we think about the health impact of communicable diseases, particularly historically, they had a tremendous impact on the whole. So this is a picture of a arena that has been opened up to people during the 1918 flu epidemic, where it had a massive impact, global impact on health. I think they estimated that about 1% of the world population died of this flu outbreak, which was about 50 million people died of the flu in this outbreak, which is a huge number of people. More people than died in World War, about 3 times the number of people who died in World War I, right? So tremendous impact from this disease, where people would get the flu, and sometimes within hours they would die from their lungs filling up with fluid. So very high mortality rate. This type of thing was not entirely uncommon historically. Now, an example of that here in the United States is in Philadelphia. There was the yellow fever outbreak in 1793. So in that case, Philadelphia was the capital of the United States at that point in time. It was the biggest city in the United States. There was this outbreak where people started dying and people didn't know why. And it was due to mosquitoes that were transmitting yellow fever. But people didn't understand at that point what was going on. So people just kept on dying, and about over a third of the entire population of Philadelphia just left the city. They just fled because they were concerned about this disease and they didn't want to get it. There were all sorts of things around quarantine which weren't effective because it was not coming externally. It was actually coming from in the city, from mosquitoes in the city. And so you saw that there was this upsurge where a tenth of the entire city died of yellow fever. So if you measure that in modern terms, a tenth of the population of a city like, say, Seattle dying and well over a third just fleeing the city, you can think about the magnitude of the type of impact that these communicable diseases had historically. So when you think about communicable diseases versus non-communicable diseases, how are they different or the same when we think about public health strategies dealing with them? Well, think about that for a second. How are they different or the same? Well, there's a few different ways that they differ, but remember when we think about non-communicable diseases, very often there's many different contributory causes to those health conditions. So they become really complex in terms of thinking about prevention strategies. Now, not to say that communicable diseases aren't complex. They certainly are. But when we because they are transmitted typically from one person to another, we actually have, if you can stop that transmission and you have this very clear contributing cause to that disease, we have, in some ways, there's a certain effectiveness to our public health strategies if we're able to intervene and prevent it from being transmitted from one person to another. And that's part of why we've been so successful in actually addressing communicable diseases in countries where there's strong public health systems. So let me just offer some definitions here when we're thinking about communicable diseases. So communicable diseases are diseases that can be transmitted from humans to humans, or animals and insects to humans, or from the environment to humans. Those are communicable diseases. We often hear the term infectious diseases. So infectious diseases is a little bit broader. It includes everything that we talked about in terms of communicable diseases, but there's also some infections that can live inside someone's body that aren't necessarily transmitted from one person to another, that sometimes you can have outbreaks of in your own body. Where, especially if your immune system is compromised, where things that live in your body normally suddenly become an outbreak, especially fungi of various sorts is an example of this. So infectious diseases can be infections that are already living in your body. So it's a little bit of a broader term there. That being said, when we talk about communicable disease and infectious diseases, very often people use them interchangeably, but there actually is a difference between the two. Another thing that I want to talk about is the differences between endemic disease, sporadic disease, epidemic disease, and pandemic diseases, or communicable diseases situations. So when we're talking about endemic, we're talking about something that exists in a population at a fairly constant rate. So it's something where you just have occasional outbreaks, occasional cases of different types of infectious diseases spread out, in different regions. Sometimes different types of diseases are more likely to be endemic to different regions of the country. Okay, so that would be an endemic communicable disease. Sporadic diseases are ones that really, they're not very common. They just pop up occasionally from time to time in different areas. Okay, an epidemic is when in a specific region you suddenly have this burst of activity where the disease is usually not present in the population, and then suddenly you see this disease popping up. So an example of that would be Ebola, for example, in 2014-2015, where, in West Africa, there really wasn't cases of Ebola happening, and then suddenly there was one case which then spread to a whole lot of people, and a lot of people died as a result. So that would be an example of an epidemic. There's also a term which is called pandemic. That's when an epidemic has actually spread to multiple countries and multiple regions around the world, and that's what we would call a pandemic. All right, so what causes different types of diseases? Well, one of the first things that we recognized in terms of communicable diseases was bacteria. So in the 1880s and 1890s, we started having germ theory because we had recognized the bacteria through microscopy, and we were starting to be able to recognize that they were transmitted from one person to another. You also had Louis Pasteur and recognition that you could, with germ theory, recognizing that you could actually sterilize things so you wouldn't pass them on from one person to another. We saw recognizing that there are things like leprosy, cholera, syphilis, and a lot of work that actually started to begin to address these bacterial diseases. This really relates to germ theory. Germ theory was developed in that time. This is often referred to as Koch's Postulates, which was essentially his proposition that there are 4 different things that you think about in terms of looking at these communicable diseases. The first is that you'd expect that organism to show that these organisms actually were a contributing cause to a disease or a cause of a disease. You need to show that the organism was present every time you had that disease. You need to show that organism could be isolated and grown, for example, in animals or some type of culture. then you need to be able to show that that culture could then cause the disease in animals, for example. And then you could re-isolate that bacteria or that disease from that animal and then reinfect to actually cause it again. So repeat that process. So if you could meet all those criteria, then you would be considered having shown that bacteria caused a disease. So we have a more modern form of Koch's postulates, and that's because for a lot of communicable diseases, you actually couldn't demonstrate that these were actually causes for a wide range of different challenges to that more specific process that was originally proposed. So here the idea is that you have to show that there is an epidemiological association between the presence of that bacteria or potential cause and the health outcome. You need to actually be able to isolate that bacteria from samples in some sort, and you need to be able to show that causative agent can be transmitted from one person to another, or an animal to a person, for example. So that transmission needs to be demonstrated. So that's how we normally think about in terms of demonstrating causation with relationship to communicable diseases. All right. So for many very serious diseases at the time, they weren't actually able to show that what was causing them using Koch's postulate. You couldn't isolate or see them. And that's because a lot of these viruses actually would pass through filters. You couldn't actually isolate them. And they don't live sort of in the same way that we think about life typically, because they don't carry out some of the functions of life, and they don't reproduce on their own. They reproduce within cells or hosts. So they did eventually find that viruses could be isolated. So they have a viral coat. They're very small, and they were able to finally crystallize them. And actually, that has led to a lot of our capacity to help address these viral causes of disease. Very common example of this is the polio virus. One of our first major successes in terms of the polio vaccine, which, polio was incredibly infectious and had a huge public health impact. But the vaccine was incredibly effective actually addressing this very serious condition that had a big impact, particularly on children. Here we see where children or individuals with polio would very, very often be isolated in these chambers, which allowed them to breathe, because polio would, for many people, would affect your ability to your lung function. So the ability to deal with that was a tremendous success, a public health success. There's other diseases which are also caused by parasites. So parasites can live in your body, for example, hookworms. We can also see that malaria is passed on through mosquitoes and has transmission into the body. And there's this cyclical nature to that. So these parasites can actually have a huge impact on public health. And there's a wide range of different types of parasites that do this: ticks and botflies and leeches and fleas, for example, that can have a substantial health impact. We also think about prions. So prions are relatively rare, but they can be incredibly severe, and bodies, incredibly lethal as well. So prions are essentially contagious proteins. Essentially what you have is you have a protein that becomes misfolded, and when the misfolded protein can then change other proteins to also become misfolded. And so this can actually pass from one person to another. And in the case of mad cow disease, it can be actually incredibly lethal. So I should call it Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease is the actual correct name. But we don't have many cases of that, but it is something that we're concerned about. And they actually are finding more diseases of this type as they study it more. It's a more recent understanding that how this happened. Then you also have fungi. So fungi have very large impacts. It can be contagious. You can pass it from one person to another. And it's a very serious thing, particularly for people who are immune compromised, because they're not able to handle this. Fungal infections that would normally not really be a problem can actually spread in a very serious way for people who don't have effective immune systems to deal with it. So how does an infection occur? So we want to think, so here's, we've talked a little bit about what some of these different types of things that are communicable diseases. How does this process actually work? All right. So the process works by, you have an initial invasion by some sort of pathogen into the body. And you're going to have an incubation period. And this is a period during which it enters the body and it essentially sits there and starts reproducing. And, you might only have a few, initial bacteria that enter the body that have to reproduce before you start seeing effects of that condition. So then you have what's called the prodromal period. And this is when you start seeing initial signs of a disease. So you might see some coughing, some fever, some fatigue, right? But you might not actually know that you have a condition. This is also called the subclinical infection period. So that's before it's really reached the clinical phase, so that we actually know that someone has a disease. It might be something that really goes under the radar. That might actually last for a fairly large amount of time. Okay. Then you have the illness period. That's when you actually have the disease. You know that you have the disease. It's apparent. You're usually, hopefully, seeking treatment for that, and you're going through the process of dealing with that disease, either responding to antibiotics or undergoing other types of treatment for that communicable disease. Then you have the convalescent period, which is as the disease is receding. And then, depending on the disease, you might actually become healthy, but then become a host. So some people you can deal with the symptoms of a disease, but you can still carry that disease. So, for example, HIV here, you can have HIV turn into full-blown AIDS, but then receive treatment, but you will still carry HIV and can transmit that if you're not taking your meds. So you can still be contagious even if you don't have symptoms after having had a condition. However, for some diseases, once communicable diseases, once you've gone through the disease and you've responded to it, your immune system now has killed off that disease and you're no longer can transmit it to other people. So that bar at the bottom is showing when a disease is communicable. So particularly during that subclinical phase and prodromal period, that's when people are most likely to pass on diseases. Now, this is really important because understanding each of these different communicable diseases and how long that period is and how infectious the disease is during that period actually really tells us a lot about that infectious disease. Because it's during that period when you seem to be healthy and you're interacting with other people, but you're potentially passing on that condition, that can determine to a large extent how contagious that disease is. So something to really think about a lot. So that asymptomatic transmission period is actually really important to understanding infection and the stage of the rate at which a disease spreads. Also, understanding how long each of these phases are makes a big difference as well. All right. So we also want to think about the reproductive ratio. So the reproductive ratio is the rate at which one person who's sick infects other people. So how many for one person who has a disease, how many people is that person likely to infect? Okay. And usually here we're assuming that it's someone who's untreated, but that number will vary depending on the public health system that we're looking at. So, for example, in countries that have a more developed public health system, the reproductive ratio might actually look different than countries that don't have as effective treatment, for example. But understanding this reproductive ratio actually helps us understand how communicable disease behaves. So if the ratio is relatively low, say 1, so one person on average affects one person, well, that tends to be more of an endemic type disease. It doesn't tend to have these really strong spikes in terms of epidemics, right? Because it's not something where it's just going to suddenly break out very fast, because it's essentially going from one person to another. Or if it's under 1, then you might see this low level of something where for example, you might see a disease come out of an animal population to a human population occasionally, just sort of see the sporadic cases. Now, there's other diseases where the reproductive ratio is higher. So 2, 4, 10, 18. These are diseases that once you get one person have that disease, then suddenly you can have this really rapid outbreak of a condition. So, for example, mumps and measles. There's a lot of real concern about vaccine resistance, because measles, for example, is tremendously contagious. And we've seen that because we've had lower rates of vaccination in the United States right now for the MMR vaccine. We're actually seeing these outbreaks where someone goes to another country, catches measles, and comes back, and then infects 50, hundreds of people. So we've seen that here in the United States, where we've had these outbreaks. Measles was almost entirely eradicated in the United States due to good vaccination rates. But, we'd have sporadic cases. But now we're seeing certain years we're having hundreds of cases in the United States, which actually have fairly severe risks, especially to people who are more susceptible to contagious diseases and perhaps immune compromise, where it can be incredibly lethal. So these types of diseases where you have the high reproductive ratio is some diseases that have a real strong risk for having an epidemic. So another thing that we want to think about when we address communicable diseases is how it infects people. So what is the process by which it's transmitted? All right. So remember, communicable diseases can be transmitted in a lot of different ways. You can ingest it, you can breathe it in, and it can infect through your lungs. It can infect through your skin. It can affect in a lot of different ways. So understanding how it gets into the body and how it goes through the range of transmission actually provides us with information about how we actually want to address that disease, what types of interventions are likely to be effective. All right, so remember, we have a wide range of different types of ways, different types of infectious agents, and part of dealing with an outbreak or a health-related situation is trying to figure out, okay, what is actually the cause of this outbreak or disease, right? So in a public health system, you want to have a very fast way of quickly identifying these infectious agents. You also want to know about the reservoir. Remember, infectious agents very often have places where they exist. So some bacteria just normally live in the soil or in the environment, and it's only when they come into human contact that sometimes through mutations or through just entering the body, they will then become a communicable disease, right? That is a particular concern in terms of animal reservoirs. So, for example, bird populations carry the flu, and some of those flus are incredibly dangerous. And sometimes have really high mortality rates. So the avian flu that outbreak that happened a while back, I think they had mortality rates in the, 60-80%. So a lot of people who got that died. And flus also transmit really fast as well. So we can talk about more about that later. But animals are a really serious reservoir, but you can also have it in food, or sometimes it's just on inanimate objects where it'll just be sitting there and it'll be on your desk and you'll touch it and it will pass on. And of course, then you have humans. Some diseases just exist in humanity and we pass it on to one another. So in terms of breaking the link in this chain of infection, some of the strategies that we use here are things like education and policy. So if we want to deal with those reservoirs, doing that. Sanitation can affect things like, water and food-borne illnesses, which were historically a major cause of disease, cholera, for example, there. But having good sanitation actually dealt with a lot of that in the United States, for example. And sterilization or disinfecting things can actually make a big difference here. Then we have the portal of exit, all right? So this is the way in which, so if a person has a communicable disease, how does it leave the body? Does it leave through blood? That's true for HIV, for example. Through the intestinal tract, through the GI tract, through feces, for example. It could leave through your breathing. So water droplets is a common way where it leaves body, or STIs, STDs, transmitting that way sexually, or generally from the skin, passing on from one another. For example, MRSA can pass through the skin just through touch. So what can we do to break that link? So washing your hands, that's one type of thing. Dealing with these secretions or things that come out of the body, trying to manage them, and properly dealing with waste, for example. So if you're so here previously we're talking about how you prevent it from sort of leaving the body, right? And then the question is, how does it actually transmit from one person to another? So it could be droplets in the air that, we breathe. We put, as I'm talking right now, I'm putting out droplets into the air of water. So it can be airborne. It can be through a vector. So it can be something like a flea or some other insect that passes it from one person to another. Or it could be through physical contact or by ingesting food. So there's a range of different ways that it will be it will actually move from one person to another, or one source to another. So again, we see similar types of things to sort of prevent this from transmission, things like sterilization, hand washing, good food handling techniques. You can also prevent transmission by isolating people. So that's the idea of quarantine, but also asking people when they have the flu to not come into work or not come into school is a way to do this. Or having good air filtration can make a difference here. Then you also want to think about, okay, if you have someone who's infected, who can then transmit it, how do you prevent, even if you have droplets leaving your body, how can you prevent that from entering the body, someone else's body? So here we're thinking about the portal of entry. Does it enter through blood, through needles, for example, from injection drugs, or does it is it by eating foods, the intestinal tract, or do we breathe in droplets and does it enter through our lungs into our body, or perhaps through our skin? So it could enter if you have cuts or on your body. STDs, reproductive tract, or other mucous membranes could actually be a portal of entry. So here again, we're thinking about hygiene type things, wound care, so wound care can prevent it from entering the body through cuts, for example, or dealing with perhaps infections, dealing with that quickly. Having good technique when you're dealing with folks in clinical settings. So those are some things to help prevent that entry into the body. We also want to think about, when we're thinking about this chain of infection, is who are the people who are the hosts of this disease. So there are very often for communicable diseases certain folks who are more likely to be hosts of a disease. So young people or older people tend to be more vulnerable as hosts, more likely to transmit diseases, partially because they are more susceptible very often to diseases. So this often relates to health status. So people who are undergoing chemotherapy or radiation are more susceptible to diseases. So they are more likely to have communicable diseases. There's different types of immunity that people might have naturally through genetic causes or other considerations. People who have inadequate nutrition are more susceptible to communicable diseases and therefore might be more likely to serve as a host of a disease. And, different types of therapies can influence this. Having these chronic illnesses can influence your risk and your probability of transmitting disease, and surgeries as well. So these are the types of things that influence health status, which can influence the risk. So when we think about these hosts, these people who are at more risk for the disease and also more likely to transmit the disease, we think about things like actually treating illnesses. So people who have chronic illnesses, you can perhaps treat it, or providing better nutrition or things like that to decrease their possibility of having this. Recognizing these high risk patients and targeting more treatment and observation and awareness education towards them can actually make a difference here as well. And obviously immunization for people who are at high risk is also really important as well. So that's a chain of infection. Remember, one of the really helpful things from a public health perspective about dealing with communicable diseases is we can actually look at how it's transmitted, and there's many different opportunities in each step of that chain to essentially break the link to prevent it from being from it spreading and from there being continuation of that disease. All right, so how do you deal with communicable diseases? Well, when we think about this from an epidemiologic perspective, first we need to diagnose the disease, think about what it is, confirm what it is, or figure out what it is in cases where we have a new disease. We also want to look and see demonstrate that there actually is an outbreak occurring. So this involves observation, monitoring for different diseases, and various reporting mechanisms in public health systems. This also relates to the idea that different at-risk populations might be different groups that you might want to focus in on in terms of looking for potential risk. And we can partially see when there's outbreak is occurring because we look at sort of baseline levels and see whether or not there's sort of a sudden spike in this. So when we think about these cases, it's actually pretty important to look at how they're occurring over time. So one is, so we have the three things: time, place, and person. So who's getting the communicable disease? That would be person. So looking at who's getting them can actually tell us if certain populations, certain groups of people are at greater risk. So when it comes to meningitis, well, research has shown that students are more likely to do it because they're more likely to be in close places with one another. So they're more likely to spread it to one another. So knowing something about people, knowing that they are students, actually gives us insight into how to prevent that disease. So knowing about the person is an important thing to study. Another thing is a place. So are we seeing that certain diseases are popping up in different regions? Well, maybe that's because there's a contaminated food source in that region. Well, then we have to think about addressing that. Or maybe we want to think about whether there's certain cultural or situational factors that, say mosquito reservoir in that area that we need to address in that specific region. And then time is also really important for thinking a little bit about how that disease is being transmitted. So we see a few different charts here, and one at the top is where we have an epidemic and outbreak. So you have, that's essentially a single source thing where, one person has a disease, they pass it on to a lot of people, but that source once you deal with that source, it just sort of disappears. Okay. So that spike. Then you can also have this, in the second graph, you can see something where there's sort of a sporadic disease that just seems to be in the population and is occurring regularly, and that source hasn't been dealt with. It's just sort of there endemic. And then you can have a repeating source. So there at the bottom, there's an example of, say you have some contaminated food source, for example. Well, someone gets that and they pass it along to other people. It's contagious, and they eat it and then they pass it along. And then you have this outbreak, and then sometime later, somebody goes back to that, has another impact from that food source, or they go into this region that has that contagious disease from mosquitoes or something like that, and then we have another outbreak. So that's where we have something that you have some source, which just you have these continual repeated outbreaks. Okay. So here's where epidemiology can give us a lot of insight by looking at who's getting it, when they're getting it, where they're getting, can tell us a lot about that communicable disease. So then, additionally, you want to think about, once you have this information about it, develop and testing a hypothesis, trying to determine, okay, what actually is causing this? Can we actually show that there's, it's called the attack rate, that where you look at the number of pieces of people over the susceptible people to actually demonstrate that there is something going on here, that there's statistical significance in this relationship between the proposed cause and the health outcome that you're concerned about. And based upon all this information, you'd of course want to implement an intervention. And that intervention is going to vary depending on what we know about that communicable disease and that chain of infection to try and figure out what is the best strategy for prevention. All right. So when we think about communicable diseases, what are our different intervention strategies? Well, we actually have a bunch of them that are actually really quite effective for dealing with this. So we have barriers, immunization, screening, case finding, treatments and contact treatments, and strategies for maximizing effectiveness and preventing resistance. So I'm going to sort of talk about those in order. All right. So first off, let's talk about barriers. So barriers essentially address the idea of the chain of infection of, okay, if you have transmission, can we prevent a disease from moving from one person to another, or from an animal or insect to another person? Okay, so can we actually just put physical barriers in place, or create physical space so that it doesn't get transmitted? So things like that would be condoms, for example, for STDs, preventing just blocking that condition from passing from one person to another. Bed nets or masks. These physical barriers can actually have a really great impact in terms of preventing disease transmission. You can also have physical space as being a barrier. So quarantine is an example here, where isolation, preventing people from being close to another so that they can't transmit it to one another, is actually a very effective barrier strategy in public health practice. Then we have immunization. So remember, we have different types of immunization. We can use antibodies. Antibodies don't usually have long-term resistance, but they can be really helpful for quick response to diseases. So essentially, you're injecting these antibodies, which will attack the contagious, the bacteria or virus or whatever that's in your body, and decrease the impact of that disease. But then we have inactivated vaccines and live viruses. Live viruses in particular are really effective at getting the body to actually respond to that disease, communicable disease. So the body creates its own antibodies, and that can create long-term resistance to a disease. So immunization is a tremendously important and effective strategy for public health. It's one of the major contributors to why 100 years ago communicable diseases were some of the main leading causes of death in the United States, and now they aren't. So these are really effective for dealing with communicable diseases, and in fact sometimes have been essentially responsible for us being able to actually eradicate diseases, as in the case of smallpox. So that being said, vaccines do sometimes have side effects, and they do have some risks, and there's a whole public health system in place to try and think about those risks. It's something that we really need to think about, and think about how we can communicate effectively to protect people, because there's a lot of concern about vaccines right now, and raising our awareness, raising our understanding of that to effectively communicate with the public about the benefits of these vaccines is actually a really important public health strategy right now. So one of the things related to this is the idea that, these vaccines are not always 100% effective. So some vaccines are not very effective at all. They're not comparatively effective. So some of them are in the 30, 50% effectiveness rate, for example. So flu vaccines very often are not entirely effective. That being said, if you can have a 50% chance of actually preventing 50% reduction of risk for getting the flu, that's pretty good, right? Nobody really wants that, right? So the fact that it's not 100% effective, though, really raises the issue that it's important for as many people to get these vaccines as possible, especially for the key ones, and particularly in at-risk populations. So, for example, it's actually required that healthcare providers get these vaccinations because they're an at-risk population because they're exposed to so many communicable diseases, right? Now, what we know is that we actually really need enough people to have vaccines for key diseases in order to have what's called herd immunity, which is that you have enough people with the vaccine to prevent, even if someone gets that disease, to prevent it from really passing on. And we find that for a lot of these communicable diseases, if we have a 70 to 90% rate of vaccination, that actually we can really keep those rates of those infectious diseases down or negligible in a population. What we're seeing, though, as I mentioned, for things like the MMR vaccine and concerns about connections to autism, which again do not exist, that we do start seeing these outbreaks in populations that have low rates. So, for example, here in Seattle, Vashon Island, it's an area where vaccination rates are terribly low for children for the MMR vaccine, for example. And we're getting cases of whooping cough and pertussis and measles. And sometimes we're actually having children die as a result. So it's a very important issue for public health. Another thing that we do is screening and case finding. So screening, like for non-communicable diseases, is actually really important in communicable diseases. So for things like screening for tuberculosis or STDs, if we regularly get checked for these communicable diseases, that can help us to detect them if someone's a carrier, for example, and actually address it before they pass it along to other folks, and actually provide treatment before they have the negative health impacts. So HIV is an excellent example here. We want to screen for HIV and have that be done for sexually active folks, because if you can catch it early, you can target treatment to them, and they don't have the risk of going into full-blown AIDS, right? And they also have a much lower likelihood of actually passing that on to somebody else. So that screening strategy, these screening strategies are really important for communicable diseases as well. The other thing is called case finding, and that's a ethically controversial strategy where you actually go and when someone gets a disease, try and find other people who they've interacted with to find other people who might have that disease. So that is, it's controversial because for STDs, there's a lot of stigma associated with that, and people aren't comfortable with that because it actually reveals other people's health status. But it's actually a really important strategy in public health. So, we really want to find people who might really be at risk as much as possible. So that's another strategy that's often used to sort of look at social networks to try and identify people who might be at risk for getting a disease. Treatment is also incredibly effective for preventing communicable diseases. And that's because if you can treat people fast, that means that they're less likely to have a long period of time where they're sick. And while you're sick, while you have the flu, while you have the cold, you'll be coughing, you'll be putting other people at risk, right? So treatment can shorten that disease and shorten the period of time in which you're likely to infect other people. And especially when it comes to screening, if you can get people while they're asymptomatic, that's also really important because those are the people who are most likely to pass it along because they don't know that they have the condition. So why would they be concerned about passing it on? They're not aware of it. So in some cases, we actually do treatment even before we know whether or not people have caught a disease from another person. So for tuberculosis, for example, we actually will, if it seems like someone has been exposed to tuberculosis, we'll treat them right away, even if we don't know yet whether they've actually caught it or not, just because it's really contagious and a really serious condition. We really want to prevent the transmission of that disease. Another case is HIV. If someone gets stuck with a needle, we treat them with meds immediately, and you can actually prevent people from getting HIV if you treat them even before you know whether or not that particular needle had HIV in it. So another thing that we think about is effective treatment and resistance. So one thing that we want to do is make sure that people are actually effectively taking their meds. So for very serious conditions, and this is really in the United States primarily done for tuberculosis, but we really want to make sure that people are actually taking their antibiotics and they actually take it for their full term, that they don't stop early, right? Because if you stop early, they're actually it's more likely that these communicable diseases will develop resistance to those antibiotics. So sometimes we have direct observer therapy where we actually make sure that people take their medications properly and regularly. So this is a huge problem, and that's because we're having this really problematic spread of antibiotic resistance. And we're actually seeing this really pop up across our population. Now, we've talked about how we've managed to actually really minimize a lot of the communicable diseases in terms of overall impact on health in the United States. But we're losing our ability to actually effectively treat a lot of these diseases because of this antibiotic resistance. So we're seeing this spike of people who are getting different diseases which are essentially untreatable at this point by our current using our certain strategies. And that's actually really scary. We really need to be thinking about this a lot from a public health perspective, because this could get really very dangerous. And we're seeing that the rates of mortality due to the antibiotic resistance is going up, so that we might actually start seeing a lot of these communicable diseases coming into the top 10 in terms of mortalities in the near future. So again, antibiotic resistance essentially happens when you have a set of bacteria. You have one bacteria that has a mutation that's perhaps exposed to antibiotics, but it gets selected because the antibiotics kill off everything that doesn't have that bacteria. But if it can live, then it can actually multiply. And that genetic trait that allows it to provide resistance to that antibiotic or something else, treatment, can then be passed on to other people. You also find, especially for bacteria, that genes pass from one type of bacteria to another. So if you develop antibiotic resistance in one bacteria, well, that can pass on to another type of bacteria that might be a much more lethal communicable disease. So one of our big problems is that we have overuse of antibiotics. It's been prescribed too much, even in situations where it's not going to be helpful. We have people don't use it properly. They don't use the full course of their antibiotics. And then we also have really widespread use of antibiotics in agricultural use when it's not necessary. And that's a really big concern, because with agricultural use, it's going into our ecosystems, and there's just so much more potential for these antibiotic resistance genes to be developed and to pass on to communicable diseases that can impact our public health. So a big question is, can we eradicate diseases, communicable diseases? Well, that's an interesting sort of strategy for public health. I mean, if we know the contributing cause of a disease and it's a single, communicable disease, well, in theory, the hope is that if we get rid of that bacteria that passes on from one to another, well, then we could just eliminate entire disease from humankind, right? So there's a few different things that we think about when we think about eradication. So we think about a question of is this disease only found in humans, or also do we find it in the animal reservoirs? Well, if it's just found in humans, well, then we have a lot more control over human population. So maybe we can prevent it from being, we can entirely eliminate it. So, knowing whether or not there's an animal reservoir makes a big difference. Rabies is really hard to entirely eliminate, for example, because we know that rabies is carried in animal populations. So we can try and deal with animal populations and prevent it from being in those populations, but it's really hard to control all animals. Mosquito-borne diseases are another example of this. Right. Another question is, does it exist in the environment for a long period of time? Right. So if you sneeze and on a surface, well, that lasts for about 3 days. Right. So if you have flu or cold, right? So that can pass from one person to another. All right. There are other things like Hep C, I believe, actually. It can actually exist on a surface for about 6 months, right? So anytime during that period of time, it can actually get into somebody else's body if they interact with it. So knowing how long that lasts is actually fairly important. The other question is, how long do people carry this disease? So do they have a long carrier state, especially if they are asymptomatic, right? So knowing how long that is going to influence how likely we are to actually be able to deal with the disease. Because if you have a lot of people out there who have a disease and are passing it on without knowing that they have it, well, that makes it a much more challenging situation. Does long-term immunity happen as a result of infection? So for some things, you get it once, and then you're not likely to ever get it again. So chickenpox, for example, is an example of this. You get it, you're not likely to have it again in your life, right? So if you have something like that, well, then you have that long-term immunity, and that can prevent reinfection. But other things like the flu, where you can just keep on getting the flu year after year, becomes a harder thing. The other question is, does vaccination confer long-term immunity? Some vaccines actually work for life. Your body develops a resistance to it, and it works for a really long period of time. Other ones, you need booster shots occasionally. And then there's some where particularly for things like the flu, where the flu mutates and evolves really fast. So essentially you have to keep on getting the flu vaccine year after year, right? So that's going to vary substantially as well. So can you get herd immunity in a population? Can you get enough people to take that vaccine? And is it actually effective for preventing that transmission for that particular disease? So that's a concern as well, right? And can you diagnose a disease quickly? All right. So again, one of the big concerns for communicable diseases is how long do people have it and are contagious before they know they have it, right? So if you can detect it early and treat it early, you minimize that risk. So that's a consideration for this. Then you have vaccination. So can you vaccinate after people have been exposed to a disease? All right. There's some vaccines that you can actually treat after exposure. So rabies is an example of that. But you have to do it relatively fast after getting it. But some vaccines don't work once you actually have the disease. So that's another factor to consider as well. So those are the different things that we think about when it comes to looking at these different diseases. Now, as you saw for the different diseases here, smallpox, polio, measles, smallpox, we actually were successfully able to entirely eradicate that disease. It does not exist anymore. And that's because there was a really good vaccine, and we had an international campaign to prevent this. And it was a big deal to do this. Smallpox is a really serious condition. Many people died of that disease. And the fact that we've been able to eliminate it is an incredible public health success, right? Things like polio, we're actually really close to eradicating. It's a little bit harder for some of these based on these different matrices, but it's still holding on in a few populations. But that's something that we're really close to actually doing, and we may be able to do. But we're seeing some pockets coming back. So we'll see how that goes. And measles is another one where here in the United States, we pretty much got rid of it. Not entirely, but we didn't see much of it. But again, because we're having decrease in our vaccination rates, we're having it pop up again. So, this is an ongoing thing for thinking about how we as public health control these different communicable diseases. HIV is a situation where we actually have a much bigger challenge in terms of thinking of actually eradicating it. When we think about looking at these different matrix in terms of thinking about these different factors, animals it's found in baboons and different primates. So can we get rid of the animal reservoir? Probably not. It has a very short half-life when it dies pretty quickly after leaving the body, except in needles, sometimes it can actually live for a fair amount of time because it's not exposed to air as much. So it can actually persist for a while in that context. The carrier state, people having it, once you have it, you have it. So carrier state is routine. So people can infect other people long term. And then we have long-term immunity. So do we have a way of actually, once you have the disease, having long-term immunity from that disease? Well, actually, no, we don't have that, right? Once you have HIV, you have it. We also have a question about vaccination. We actually don't really are able to do that because we don't have vaccines yet. Herd immunity, again, we have a lot of people who have the disease. We also don't have the ability to have herd immunity because we don't have the vaccine. Can we easily diagnose it? Well, it's not something where there's a visual way of diagnosing it once you get it. So the main way that we do that is through screening to prevent transmission, to identify early so we can deal with it. And that also there's no vaccination strategy. So HIV is an example of when we use this test, it's a much harder thing to challenge to deal with. All right. So what are some future challenges for thinking about communicable diseases? We know that new diseases evolve all the time. So there's mutations. New diseases that are present in animal populations can evolve so that they come to human populations. So that's it's something that we have to keep on monitoring and being able to identify outbreaks of these new diseases when they occur. Antibiotic resistance, as I mentioned, is a very serious concern. Where a lot of our public health strategies, some of the most effective public health strategies, may be eliminated for a lot of conditions. So a real concern there. Bioterrorism, some of these communicable diseases can actually be weaponized. So we have concerns about things like smallpox. Could someone recreate the smallpox and cause major outbreaks in certain countries? Fear of vaccines and the fact that we have a decrease in this vaccination rate. Well, that's a real serious concern where we're actually seeing the concrete effects of that in terms of measles outbreaks. And then, generally speaking, we want to make sure that we have effective health systems because health systems are what ensure that we detect diseases when they occur, that we properly treat them, and that we ensure this overall protection of populations. And that we detect these outbreaks when they actually occur. So that's communicable diseases in a nutshell. It's a really interesting area. It's one of our major success stories when it comes to public health strategies. It's also an area of tremendous opportunity for developing nations. But there's a lot of challenges that we have moving forward to think about in it as well. And what's really nice here is that there's a lot of different strategies that we can use that are quite effective. And once we know more about these communicable diseases and have monitored and recognized these outbreaks when they occur, we can actually go in and make a tremendous difference for population and prevent the very severe effects that can occur from these communicable diseases. So thank you very much for listening and take care.